Hi there, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome to the Keiser Report. You know, governments and bankers around the world are invincible thanks to big baby Ben Bernanke's magic money printing. Able to survive the fastest deflation, jump over the biggest accounting black hole, thanks to the wizards of central banking. Stacy, woman, tell me more.
Max, did they tell you that story?
Yeah, I believed them again, that they were wizards. They could make it all better.
Well, my first headline is an analogy for that. We see this Thai wizard held after bulletproof tattoo brawls. So a sorcerer tattooist in Thailand, Max, has been arrested after several brawls involving young disciples of his, all these teenage boys, were painted with these tattoos that they were told would make them invincible to gunshot wounds and knife wounds. Well, sure enough, they went out to test this and see if it actually worked, so there were huge brawls. Police arrested the teenagers and asked them why they fought. They said they were tattooed because they believed it would make them invincible and wanted to test whether it works or not. They used sticks and knives, but guns were rarely seen in the brawls.
I think this is the first time we're seeing bleeding from the virtual game world into the analog sticks and stones can actually break my bones world. In other words, this generation that's brought up with magic potions on fantasy virtual worlds have been unable to migrate into the non-virtual world where buying a trinket to give you magic powers actually doesn't exist. This generation coming up is doomed.
Well, is there a game called Pinball Wizard? Because, you know, this guy was a wizard, and many of us in the global West, they think of the central bankers and the treasury departments of having some sort of wizard-like powers. And I always think of it as like a pinball game. They're trying to get the ball, you know, they're cheating. They're lifting up the game and trying to get the ball to go down into the right spot.
You are talking about would be tilting the machine, and a big screen comes up, a big letters, T-I-L-T on the pinball, tilt. And this, in fact, came up a few years ago for the global economy in 2008, a gigantic tilt. If the moon were lit up with neon pinball types of machinery, it would have said tilt, tilt, tilt to alert the world that, in fact, the global economy was crashing. But, however, the purveyors of the global banking system played on.
Well, they're playing on this game of pinball in Iceland, and I wanted to look at this because the government authorities there are trying to get the balls to go into the right holes in the pinball game, and it's not quite working. Iceland sees bubble threat from foreign investor cash, mortgages. So, Max, apartment prices have soared 17% since April 2010, are now just 1.7% below the pre-crisis peak in March of 2008. The boom stems from currency restrictions imposed in 2008 to prevent the collapse of the krona after the country's biggest banks defaulted on $85 billion of debt. So housing bonds are the place where all these investors who've been trapped in the country because of capital controls brought in 2008. So you've got billions of dollars of investor capital trapped there, and they're all going into the housing bond market.
Be careful what you wish for. You know, Iceland did a number on the bankers and kicked them out, and as a result their currency became solid again, and the rating agencies gave them escalating ratings, and they said, you know, Iceland is a good place to do business. But this attracted the hot money. The hot money has come in from all over the world, fleeing the United States and Europe and Asia, looking for a nice place to park their cash, and they've ended up in Iceland, causing yet another bubble.
The bubble is caused by them being trapped inside Iceland. They can't take the money out, and that was in order to keep the entire economy from collapsing in 2008. Now, in the article, they point out that Iceland is actually seeking to enter the euro currency. So they are planning on allowing this money to flee eventually, but that might be in 2015. And because of the price rises in the housing prices, people think the economy is recovering and growing. So what Sigridur Ingadóttir, chairman of the Parliament's Welfare Committee in Reykjavik, says, the capital controls have created an abnormal situation, and they lead us to believe that the economic situation is better than it really is. We're living in an artificial world with the Icelandic krona, which isn't a real currency. We just prop the krona up like a real currency with legislation which protects her for the time being.
Right, so the money is trapped in Iceland with the invisible people, the little people. If you recall, Iceland, like the leprechauns of Ireland, they have their own breed of invisible little people. And now the little people, I guess, are preventing from the capital from crossing over, thus creating some normalized situation, forcing these house prices. So the average Icelandic person, like everyone else in this bifurcated, fakakta world, can't afford a house because of this crazy banking thing.
Well, the point is, for me, Max, is that we're in this pinball wizard world, a world of wizards and invincible tattoos on us. But the fact is, if we actually try to act on it, if we think those invincible tattoos will protect us from gunshots, as what happened with the Thai story, the police said actually all the guys ended up in the hospital once they got stabbed. Here, the thing is, the capital controls are meant to protect the economy, but now they're in a moment of stasis. They can't move anywhere because to withdraw it means the whole thing comes plunging down.
Okay, I think I get your pinball analogy here. So you're playing pinball, the ball is the hot money, and it's ricocheting back and forth amongst those posts in the pinball game. And if you're in the right side of that trade, you're a hedge fund, you made the right bet, you get extra points. However, it could be that the ball ends up going down the side of the machine into the gutter and you lose a point, or it goes into a penalty, you lose a point. The point being here that there's no economic rules, there are no schools of economy, there is nothing actually guiding this global economy. It's just a random behavior of hot money bouncing around inside the capital control world of a pinball machine god wacko, and there's no way to predict it, and Iceland now finds itself caught right back up into the volcano of catastrophe.
Well, yes, the thing is whether or not they could ever exit the game, whether they could ever enter the real world again from their virtual currency world. Because as the Times today in London was saying that perhaps Iceland, what's going to happen when they ever actually have to go back into the real bond market, and people fear being trapped there. Now, a big bond market story is in the news from Argentina, because as you know, in 2002, they defaulted on $100 billion. Well, 93% of the bondholders of that $100 billion have accepted basically a reduced payout. But 7% held out, and they went through the courts, and now the courts in the U.S. federal courts have ruled that basically Argentina has to pay everybody out, all of those $100 billion in bonds. So I'm going to go to a story in Argentina that is like an analogy for what Argentina did back in 2002. Man set on fire in Argentina over debt. A man was arrested on Monday in Buenos Aires for allegedly setting another man on fire during an argument over unpaid debt. The debtor apparently thoroughly doused the collector with a flammable liquid, set him on fire, and then let the victim burn, closing the front door before fleeing on foot, but a group of local residents caught him and called the police. So this is what Argentina did to their creditors at the same time. They were the debtors, they set the creditors on fire, but a few survived, and they've come back to haunt them.
Because they got some of those Thai tattoos that give them immunity from being burnt up by the creditors. No, clearly, Stacy, the problem is that when you have a system run by bankers for bankers, there's no ability to impose unanimity in any kind of resolution. So they came up with a deal to satisfy the creditors with some kind of payment, but a bunch of holdouts, vultures, whose interest lies only with themselves, are willing to throw the country back into the gutter to make a quick buck. I mean, that's the problem by having regulators in the global banking system run by the bankers who themselves are benefiting by not having any regulation.
Well, the headline for this, Max, reads, Argentina faces tough choices after U.S. debt ruling. 93% of Argentine bondholders agreed to swap their defaulted debt for new issues in 2005 and 2010, but holdout creditors who rejected the swaps continue to press in courts worldwide for full repayment on the bonds. So last month, a federal appeals court in New York ruled that Argentina violated bond provisions to treat all creditors equally when it made payments to creditors who accepted the swaps while refusing to pay the holdouts. So the decision, of course, led to a bond sell-off, a credit downgrading from S&P and Moody's.
Right. Once again, the government's saying we're powerless to do anything against the bankers. But they were not powerless in allowing the bankers to impose their system of governance to begin with. We see this in Ireland. We see this in Greece. We see this all over the world. We see it now in Iceland. We see it in Argentina. There's two sets of laws. The bankers have the ability to make up the law as they're going. And then the governments say, well, we can't possibly respond by changing the law in a way that would match how the law just got changed by the very people that are now imposing their economic will on our country. That's not a government. Argentina immediately needs to realize that their government is in league with the bankers. The Irish government is in league with the bankers. The Icelandic government is in league with the bankers.
It also is a real challenge to what you look at in Europe. Europe claims they've made some deals regarding Greece. This is 10 years later, and a U.S. federal court has ruled that no, Argentina, you have to pay everybody. And now no U.S. banks are allowed to pay. They've been paying the 93% of bondholders who did the deal. No U.S. banks are now allowed to funnel that money to those bondholders, because then without also funneling it to those 7% at 100 cents on the dollar. Argentina has stayed out of global credit markets since its 2002 debt debacle, partly due to fears the holdouts could block a new issue. It relies instead on the central bank's foreign reserves to pay debt, but its efforts to safeguard those funds using capital controls and import curbs have worsened an economic slowdown. So like I said, we're in this game where everybody's rigging, everybody's pushing at other sides of the pinball game. Now Argentina has $40 billion in foreign reserves, and the U.S. federal courts are saying that, you know, they could use that money to pay the bondholders.
Well, the lesson here is that 10 years later, they are still trying to work this out. That's the lesson that Ireland needs to understand, that, and that Greece needs to understand, because the way that they're being talked to by the IMF, the World Bank, the Troika, is that just do one more tranche, just accept one more austerity measure, and this will all go away. That is a load of codswallop. This will be going on for 10 years in Ireland. This will be going on for 10 years in Greece. It'll be starting in America and going on for 10 years in America. It's been going on for 20 years in Japan. You've got a bunch of zombie, sycophant, vampire, bankster terrorists sucking the lifeblood out of billions of people around the world, and it's always the same story. Just accept this bag of worms today, it'll all be better tomorrow. As the people in Argentina, it's been going on for 10 years.
And none of the tattoos that are the economic, fiscal, and budget policies that our governments, central banks, and politicians are imposing on us have apparently provided us immunity from the deadly financial bankster weapons.
You want to see my tattoo?
I've already seen it.
All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Stay tuned for the second half of the show. I'll be speaking to Tuur Demeester about the gloom of central banking. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Argentina and speak with Tuur Demeester of macrotrends.be and author of the new paper, The Gloom of Central Banking. Tuur, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Hi, Max. Nice to be with you.
All right, Tuur, the European Central Bank recently released a 55-page report called Virtual Currency Schemes. Tell us about it. Tell us about the gloom behind this ECB report.
Well, it's very interesting. It got out last week, and when you read it, it first seems to be just about, it could be about any online competition for the central banks, any other types of currencies. But when you read into it, there's 183 mentions of Bitcoin, and they also mentioned that they wrote this report because they got a lot of questions from the public in the past few months. And I mean, this has to be because of Bitcoin. So, I mean, and that of course raises the question, why would one of the most powerful financial institutions on the planet, why would they bother writing about Bitcoin? Because you could just as well see it as some kind of mathematical puzzle whereby geeks just send back and forth some bits and bytes over the internet. So why do they take this seriously? And that caused me to look back and find some other papers written by the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, and also look back at how they wrote about online competition in the past. And there's reports in 1996, for example. So to compare these two impressions they give is really, really interesting. And it turns out that Bitcoin for them is a totally different ball game. And frankly, they don't know very well how to deal with it.
The world of central banking, of course, is a centralized system of manipulating and controlling money, so-called in their eyes, whereas Bitcoin, by its very definition, is a fully distributed form of money and banking. Can you compare the two along those lines?
Actually, you can do it very easily by comparing the reports. And what I'm going to say now is literally coming from the ECB report. It's kind of like a commercial for Bitcoin, but they actually say that Bitcoin is not backed by fiat money. It's also not backed by a commodity, and that's very different from the e-currencies in the past. Also, the clearing of Bitcoins, which is checking whether the currency is, nobody spends his money twice. This happens in a decentralized network. So, I mean, all these things make the European Central Bank realize that they have very little grip on this thing. Also, they say it can operate independently from the banking system. They talk about how fast the clearing happens. I mean, and we all know, I mean, to do a payment these days, it can last 3 days if there's a weekend involved, or it can cost you a lot of money if you're doing it internationally. So they say it's ultra fast and it's very cheap. They mention on how the money supply automatically is limited by the Bitcoin protocol. And they also talk about how the complete discretion is possible. If you want to be anonymous with Bitcoin, it's perfectly possible.
Let's talk about the Bitcoin protocol for a second and put it into context of the following. We have three examples here. We've got gold, we have fiat money like the dollar or the euro, and then we have Bitcoin. Now, some would argue that Bitcoin is a lot more like gold and silver because gold and silver are limited supply, therefore they're banking on a certain degree of scarcity, whereas fiat money, it's an unlimited supply. There's no end to how much printing that the central banks can do. And if you look at Bitcoin, however, it's more like gold and silver because the Bitcoin protocol, or as you called it already, the mathematical puzzle, is scarce. It's limited. There is a limited number of Bitcoins to be created. Talk on that a little bit, Tuur.
Well, yeah, exactly. If you look at what the mandate is of central banks in general, often it mentions something like, well, you know, we have the duty to make sure that in the medium term inflation remains in check. I mean, this is all very vague, and we all know today how much printing there is going on. But looking into the source code of Bitcoin, which can only be changed by consensus, so it cannot. I mean, you can only copy the source code and start your own currency, which may be possible. Maybe in the future we'll have, I don't know, Obama coins or some other type of coins, but the current Bitcoin network will not respond because the code will be different. So the supply of Bitcoins is mathematically limited to 21 million Bitcoins. There's a little over 10 million right now, and by, I think, around 2025, we'll be approaching the 21 million.
Okay, let's talk about competition. The central banks around the world enjoy an oligopoly. They have the sole governmental right to print money, and they do so in a coordinated fashion, and they do so in many times to manipulate prices of other commodities, for example, gold and silver, to keep those prices low relative to the dollar and other fiat currencies. We know that there are several lawsuits right here in London against HSBC and others for blatantly manipulating prices and selling counterfeit securities into the marketplace and engaging in naked short selling. So you have in the futures markets this ability, if you're Blythe Masters or JP Morgan, to manipulate the price of silver down and gold down to keep the value of the dollar up. But in the case of Bitcoin, Tuur, I would think that this is a big competitive threat to the central banks because the central banks and their minions at the investment banks are incapable of manipulating markets in such a way as to stop this competitive threat of Bitcoin from cutting into their business. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, because it's perfectly possible for people to exchange Bitcoins without using the banking system at all. So they're not exposed to it if they don't want to. I mean, this is happening today. People are saving in Bitcoins. They're paying for services in Bitcoins. So yeah, I totally agree.
Now, Tuur, we're coming up to the 2-year anniversary of the Keiser Report's campaign to crash J.P. Morgan and buy silver, the idea being that J.P. Morgan has a huge position naked in silver. If you take it off the market, you crash the bank. They've been coming back with hundreds of millions of ounces of counterfeit silver contracts to keep the price low. But if I were to say to you, Tuur, that crash J.P. Morgan buy Bitcoin as kind of a follow-up, your thoughts? I
mean, from the perspective of the central banks, at least, you can tell that they are afraid of losing market share. They're afraid to lose. They're afraid to be neglected because they need, and they say this explicitly, they need the confidence of the people, they need the trust of the people, and in this latest report they say literally, and I quote, virtual currencies could have a substitution effect on central bank money if they become widely accepted. And of course the same goes for any fiat money in the world and also any kind of bank paper. If people stop buying derivatives, if people stop trusting their pension funds and saying, well, I want to be my own banker, well, today it's perfectly possible. It's harder with gold and silver because there's this international quality. If there's a situation of capital controls, it's a lot harder to move. Right now it's still doable, but in the future probably less so, to move gold and silver across borders. But with Bitcoin you can be your own banker and you can be your own international banker.
Right. It should be noted that you could sell $1 million worth of gold into Bitcoins, put those Bitcoins on a thumb drive, walk over a border, and use that $1 million in Bitcoins to buy $1 million in gold the next day. So it's a way to travel around with, it could be $1 billion of gold. It doesn't matter because electrons are effectively free. But there have been digital currencies in the past, Tuur, but central banks didn't worry about these. Why not then and why now?
Well, they didn't worry about them because essentially they operated in a similar fashion as central banks. They were often backed by fiat money, like an enterprise that would start emitting an e-currency. They would have a bank account with dollars, and those dollars were backing the virtual currency. They were just making it easier for people to move money around, not so much inventing a really new money. There was also e-gold, who was backed by gold. But the problem there is, once you have something that's backed by something, then there is a link with the real world. And where there is a link with the real world, then authorities can go there, they can confiscate, they can regulate, they can intimidate. And this is what happened with e-gold, for example. It was very successful, it was growing, and in 2005 they had to close shop because the feds were all over them. This is not possible with the Bitcoin network.
All right, Tuur Demeester, you are living in Argentina at the moment where capital controls were recently introduced. So tell us how you have seen Bitcoin used to circumvent capital controls in Argentina.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and there was a surge in interest in Bitcoin from the moment these because there's always been some capital controls in Argentina, but now, I mean, they really kicked in the beginning of 2012. So there was a lot of interest in this option, and so what I see today is that people are using it. I've seen people foreigners who come into Argentina and they buy their pesos using Bitcoin, so they sell Bitcoin to buy pesos. There's local Argentinians I've met who are saving in Bitcoin because it protects them against inflation. I met people who have mining rigs, they're mining Bitcoin here in Argentina. So it's really interesting to see how this is used in people's everyday lives without regard of whatever law there happens to be in place, because Bitcoin is totally unregulated. It's just a couple of bits and bytes on a computer.
Tuur, how is Argentina doing overall? The country obviously was in dire straits not too long ago. Then it popped back to life, and now it seems like it's going through some tough times again. Your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a renowned think tank here that predicted the crash of 2001. They predicted the government default. Well, right now they're saying it's going to happen again, and it's going to happen within the next 5 years, they predict. I probably suspect it's going to be sooner. And looking from the perspective of Bitcoin, I think it's really interesting for everybody to look at how Bitcoin is used in Argentina, because if you want to test a system, or in our case a currency, then I mean you want to expose it to some brutal circumstances. You want to throw it out there in the jungle, and Argentina really is the financial jungle today. I mean, there's capital controls more than you can dream of. So to see how this currency can flourish in such a hostile environment, I mean, it's very hard to get dollars here. It's extremely hard to find gold in this country, let alone silver. So, I mean, I think this is a lesson for the world, because I think in the future the world is going to look a lot more like Argentina as the government slowly run out of money.
All right, Tuur Demeester, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks for having me.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Tuur Demeester. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.